The episode you're about to listen to is part of Season 2 series on the body, how our bodies shape our experience, and how they both inspire and enable us to create art. Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. On this show, we meet artists transforming lives with their work. Is there something that you're not good at? Is it something creative? I'm curious, why do you think you're not good at it? When I was in elementary school, I took ballet lessons. They were so much fun. I loved wearing ballet slippers and the sound they made on the wooden floor of the dance studio, that sound. The class met once a week, and it seemed like every female friend I had was also in the class. One time, there was a substitute teaching the class. She was very young and was a really great dancer herself. I don't think she had any experience teaching children, though. I imagine that as a group, we were a bit more rambunctious than she was really prepared for. But I will say that at that age, I was very much a rule follower, and I remember her asking us all to go to the bar and work on our pliés. I did the over to the bar, grabbed it with my left hand, I had my right arm extended, and she calls, "First position." I do my little duck feet to go into first position, and I do that plié. Then second position, I do that plié. Third position, and I'm thinking, I am really nailing these pliés. Then, "Pam Uzel," this teacher yells my name out in class. "Stop goofing around and do your pliés the right way." Honestly, I don't know what my body was doing instead of the pliés I thought I was doing. But I do know that I never, ever went back to that ballet class again. The story I told relates to the guest on this episode in two ways. One, it's about building awareness in your body so that your body can become a creative tool. The second way it relates is that the guest on this episode, Catherine Monahon, believes that many people lose their connection to creativity in large part because of getting negative feedback when they tried something creative. To create something is a really vulnerable act. Catherine created a podcast called Material Feels, which is all about artists and their relationship with their materials, why they love working with a certain material, how they first made the connection to that material, and why it's their thing that allows them to be a creative being. According to Catherine, creativity is a human right. Their podcast, Material Feels, is an invitation to anyone to consider their relationship with the material world and find that true connection to the medium that allows them to practice their creativity. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Listen and let us inspire you. Besides hosting the podcast Material Feels, Catherine Monahon is a ceramicist. In fact, they have a great shop on Etsy called Waveform Ceramics. Get it? Waveform, a little audio reference there, where you can see the beautiful things that they create from clay. They could easily fill an episode talking about their work with clay. But I've asked Catherine to be on the show today because of the work that they do in writing and vocal performance for their podcast. The range of tone and the variety of vocals that Catherine uses during their performance make their podcast a truly delightful listen. They describe their podcast as a love letter to the material world. I wanted to find out from Catherine about how they work with the body as their material for making this podcast. Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by just telling everyone a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do?
Sure. Hi, Pam. Thanks so much for having me. I am an artist and an audio storyteller, and I have a background in art education. So I've been making art my whole life. I've done a little bit of teaching here and there, and I make a podcast called Material Feels, which is a love letter to the material world. I spend time with artists and makers and all kinds of people who have very specific relationship with a particular material.
I love that description that it's a love letter to the material world. I really enjoy your podcast, and I reached out to you to be on the show because I love your description. I think I first heard it in the episode with Hilary Ray.
Mm-hmm.
She is a storyteller, but in this, you talk about how your voice is your medium. And as a fellow podcaster, I found your description enlightening and also helpful. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this idea of your voice being your medium.
Sure. I've done some thinking around it as preparing for our conversation. And I think of someone's voice as sort of like the locus of emotion. Like there's so much in someone's voice that they can communicate. It's not just the word choice, it can be the pacing, it can be how they're holding their body while they're talking. Are they making eye contact? There's so much that is communicated through people's voices. And so,
Mm.
as an audio storyteller, I listen to my own voice a lot while I'm editing and scripting and drafting. And so there's this kind of awareness and introspection around how to use my tool and what am I communicating and how might I communicate it a little bit differently? What's my goal? Who am I talking to? All those questions are kind of, I find that there are some answers in the material of voice.
Mm. Well, it's interesting because one thing I love about your narration is the so much variety in your voice in terms of tone, depending on what you're saying, humor. You'll often go into either a humorous or an exaggerated character voice during your narration. And it just is so revealing. I think I could be wrong, but it's to me, it feels so revealing of you as the host. I never forget that you're the host and that you are contributing as much as your guest, which I don't want you to feel like I'm saying that's a negative. That is, I enjoy your hosting as much as I enjoy your guest stories. So that's interesting to me. Can you talk about this a little bit more? You go into great detail about how you care for your voice and how you prepare to do these narrations.
Sure. And just to speak to the different ways I use my voice, that is a choice that I made through encouragement of some listeners and some family members and friends who enjoy when I am myself. And I started to put more and more of myself into my show. And so I'll like throw in a joke here and there. I'll share some really personal information, but I'll also share some well researched information. So I want to be taken seriously in those times. And then other times I want to have some levity. And I do have a very silly personality that I don't usually, I have a very like professional air at times. I can really put it on. And I actually remember one of my oldest friends, his name's Chris, and he met me, but he didn't remember meeting me. He met me twice. The first time he met me, I was in professional mode. And he was like, oh, this person has no personality. Well, whoever this is, I don't really care. I'll never see them again. And then the next time he met me, we were dancing. We were doing like a line dance or something, a group dance at a bar. And I was just like, woo, singing and dancing. And he thought I was a completely different person.
Wow. You have talked about code switching, and that's similar to what we're talking about in terms of your voice. But when you talk about this idea that you want to be taken seriously, but you also want to insert your personality, which can be a little bit silly. That's another thing I really love about your podcast is the way that you contextualize things, because you take us into so many social justice issues around, you know, this particular artist or the work that they're doing. And then the next minute, you have me seriously very in a somber mood thinking about something, and then you're telling a joke, and the joke doesn't detract from the seriousness of the material. In fact, it helps it stick a little bit better, I think.
Well, thank you for that feedback. I think the reason I do that is because I imagine sitting with someone who I care about or sitting with a group of people I enjoy, and we're going into a somber place or a serious place, and we're all feeling those feelings. And I think about what would I then want to say next, and how can we shift up the energy? We don't have to stay in one place, and it doesn't detract from what we already talked about. They can go back to that thought and go back to those feelings.
Mhm.
That's why I do that.
Yeah, it's really effective. And I'm often amazed at how you sort of seamlessly take us from this one very focused type of artwork and material, and you build out into this bigger context. And, along the way, you do have us going up and down in terms of tone and the feeling that we're experiencing as you take us along. So you're really good at that. The other thing, you just released an episode that I found really interesting, which was called Sister Practices. And it's about running and then also writing. And one conversation we had, you did talk a little bit about how your creativity comes out through physical activity. And I'm wondering if you can just expand on that.
Sure. So I find that moving my body and engaging with the material world and running on dirt all kind of fall into this creative practice, this category of creative practices that allow my mind to do something different. I'm not writing A, B, C, D, E, F. I'm not writing like a linear thing. I'm not looking at my to-do list. I'm not worrying in the same way. It kind of allows me to think about things in a more organic way. Like the materials around me and my body influence my thought process.
Hmm. But I find this really interesting because I think a lot of us feel that there are very distinct separations between, okay, now I'm sitting down to write and I need the room to be quiet and I need to have my cup of coffee or tea next to my elbow and sitting in my favorite chair or whatever it is, which can all be a beneficial part of your practice. But I'm just really interested in this idea of how thoughts can, when I imagine you talking about this, I almost feel like your thoughts are being dislodged as you are out in the world moving.
I think there's something to be said for having your ritual and your space and however that serves you, like knowing what you need. But I think there's also, it's really important to step outside of that and don't limit yourself and say, well, I need my special pen. I need my desk to look a certain way, because I think that does give us a sense of security and it's also helpful for like routine, but trying mixing and matching and trying different things, you might find that like your ideas are still good and maybe they're even better and maybe they feel better.
Yeah. Well, I want to loop back to your idea for this podcast, this love letter to the material world. Your episode about polymer clay, for example, it was so much about your physical interaction with that material. And why do you think it's important for people to hear this kind of podcast about artists and their chosen material?
I'm glad you asked that. It's so important to me. This is why I made this show, is because being in art education and being someone who naturally just has a lot of art happening around them, I hear a lot from friends, family, and former students. I'm bad at art. I'm not creative. I can't draw. For some reason, people think drawing is directly correlated to being good at art. It's not. And I felt that, or I feel that creativity is a human right and that we're all born being artists. We're all born with creativity just exploding out of our eyeballs, out of our ears, whatever. And so I have noticed a disconnect between the way that art has been taught, or the way that people think about art in our society, and how we can engage in the material world, and how we were sort of distanced from that because of the way we work, the way we live, the way society is set up. And so I wanted to make something that would bring people back into their own bodies and back into what's accessible in their circle and whatever they can kind of put their hands on. And then by acknowledging those two things, it's almost like the creativity just happens and you're like, oh, I have that. I am creative.
I love that creativity is a human right. It makes me think of my mother, who would have never called herself an artist, but she was one of the most creative people that I know, in terms of she sewed so many things. We had this Christmas tree full of handmade Christmas ornaments that she painstakingly sewed. And I am so curious, do you get resistance from people who feel like, oh no, I don't have a creative bone in my body. I can't ever be creative?
There are definitely people out there that are extra resistant, and it typically comes from being shamed as a kid, or told. There are people who tell people that they're not good at art, and that's like a major no-no. There have been so many important teachers and mentors in my life who I adore, and I'm so grateful that I never had an art teacher who told me that I was bad at art. But it happens. And I think it's because in some circles, sometimes there's a very limited concept of what art is. And so when someone has been told that they're not good at that, or something that they created isn't acceptable, it's like the path of least resistance is the path of most resistance, where it's like, okay, I'm definitely never trying that again. That's not who I am. I'm this person. So I think it's just a matter of continued conversation with that person until you figure out what makes them tick. Like, what do they love? And then usually I can like connect some type of creative thing to what they love.
Yeah. And it sounds like your idea of creativity is pretty expansive.
Yeah, I'm particularly attached to materials that you can touch or manipulate, materials that you can transform. Personally, I'm not as interested in conceptual art or digital art. So it's the tactile thing. That's pretty much my only limitation. And so within anything tactile, I think it's endless creativity for me and for anyone who resonates with that philosophy.
Right. Well, I heard something in your podcast that when you're speaking about teachers and encouragement, it reminded me of this. You talked about having very early experience, we're talking elementary and middle school, in theater. How do you think that that helped you to follow in a creative path?
I love theater. I'm still a theater nerd. I love musicals. I grew up just being all kinds of characters on stage, and my best friends in elementary school and middle school were also really into theater. So it's just an opportunity to play, and the range of emotion. I mean, I think I was really influenced by that. And I kind of stopped in high school. It kind of petered out. I did a little bit in college, but just the ongoing practice of being a kid and a teenager and being celebrated for being emotional on stage, that I
Right.
think that absolutely honed my storytelling skills and my confidence in sharing stories.
And it also is another art where you're using your body and your voice as your instrument, so to speak, in order to create the illusion of this world on the stage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can definitely see that connection with your narration, because I do feel like, more than a lot of hosts that I hear, you really allow yourself to be many different characters as you speak. I'm really curious to know, how do you find the artists that you interview?
I just look for artists or creators or makers, small business owners, people who are unconventional. And I'm putting air quotes right there. People who have not had center stage in the art world historically. So marginalized genders, folks of color, immigrants, folks who are not classically trained, like anyone who would be, I guess, underdog, although I don't really like that term. People with just life experience that I want to center and in art and audio.
So when you are in front of your microphone getting ready to record, what is that experience like for you?
So I've hydrated for a couple days. I've been thinking about how this is my time to record. It usually only takes like 20 to 30 minutes. And I have my script up and I imagine my listeners. So I typically have the same amount of listeners on average per episode. So I imagine that group of people. And sometimes I think about it as an auditorium so that I'm speaking to a big group of people. And sometimes I think about it as just one person. It depends on my tone, it depends on the topic. So if I'm sharing that I have dealt with some heavy mental health issues, I'm imagining one listener sitting with me looking into my eyes. If I'm sharing like, hey, this is a background on where clay is from, and this is when glass was first ever discovered, I'm going to get a little bit more peppy, and I'm imagining that I'm on stage and or maybe I'm teaching a class. So my imagination goes to different places depending on the mood that I'm setting and the content of the work.
I think for a lot of podcasters, making friends with the sound of their own voice is a challenging journey. What about for you?
So for me, I enjoy my voice for the most part now, but I think that it sometimes sounded a little too girly for me. You know, I'm a non-binary person, and I think sometimes I wish I just had a voice that was just like deeper and, you know, more raspy. I love it when I lose my voice. I love it. I'm like, oh, yes, I sound like Fran Drescher, you know. For some reason, that's the aesthetic I like. But so that was definitely like embracing it, you know, like I get peppy, I get excited. My register's up here a lot of the time. And then I work with my associate producer, Elizabeth Delise, who is the musician and the composer for the show. They write original music. They're also my best friend of 10 years. And so when I talk to my best friend of 10 years, I'm speaking differently than when I'm like thinking I might be on NPR, you know? And that was a real icebreaker because I interviewed Liz for the show, and listening to us talking together, I was like, oh my God, this is who I am. I go, oh my goodness. And I talk really fast, and I'm not just like, welcome to, you know, so I think through just being myself on the mic and then listening to it, you're like, okay, you've got a range. And what can we do with that? You know, how can we flex from one thing to the next?
Well, in that answer, you just went through some of these characters that you create with your voice. Can you tell me more about them?
Sure. I love this. This is so fun. I don't get to talk about this very often. Well, I think there's definitely like the bashful one who's like, I like guilty pleasure one, you know, where you admit that you did something silly or foolish or weird, and you're like, I'm just crazy. Like, ooh, I did that. And then there's like the self-serious one that knows that they're being a little too serious, like the dramatic. And then I turned around and I saw for the first time who I really could be. You know, you got to poke fun at that a little bit because that is a voice in audio. Yeah.
Yes.
And then there's sometimes when I'm sharing something, I've actually almost cried while reading narration a couple times, and I keep that in there, and that was really hard for me to do in the beginning, but then once I just feel so in line with the show, and I feel like this is my life purpose, and so if I'm gonna get emotional and cry, so be it. I think the listener should hear that.
Yeah, this is so nice to hear. I feel like you've been doing this a little bit longer than I have. And I feel like trying to pin down your podcasting voice and have it be something that people can stand to listen to, but at the same time, not completely phony is one of the biggest challenges to me. And I like that this journey you've gone through of, making friends with and accepting your voice and allowing all of the variation of your personality that's expressed through your voice to happen on your show.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah. I mean, I think we all, much like how creativity is a human right, like the range of your voice is your right. And so
Mm.
all the emotions that you can express, all of the wild ideas or the thoughts or the emotions, those are yours to share. And I think people enjoy hearing all the different flavors. Yeah.
So, what are you aware of when you're recording and using your voice?
So there's so much to be aware of in the sense of podcasting and your mouth. People talk about mouth sounds all the time. So, but I also think about my entire body. So, the way that I'm carrying myself, my posture, my back, how I'm engaging my muscles, my throat. Is my throat warm? Is it loose? Is it tight? My tongue, what's my tongue doing? There's different ways to use your lips. You can use your whole face to make an emotion and talk, or you can say the same exact thing with your face not making any movement. So it changes. Yeah, it really changes. You can tell when someone's smiling on the phone. I think our facial structure, and that's also a part of like being a good listener and taking listening as a way of shaping your own voice. I'm aware of all of that, and I make the facial expressions that I would make if you were sitting with me and looking at me and listening to me. And I think that helps me with the pacing, with the feeling, and the tone of my voice.
Uh, yes. Yes, I can hear that. And I'm going to think about that from now on when I'm on the mic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes. Thank you for that. I feel like I just got it.
Thanks for letting me share that.
Well, I feel like I just got a major lesson in how to record and to add that to your voice.
Oh, yeah. I started looking stuff up because I was getting really frustrated. I have a massive tongue. And so I was getting really frustrated because I was like, God, my tongue is just like in the way of my words. And then I learned about how you can change the way your tongue interacts with the inside of your mouth, which is like, who thinks about that?
Oh my gosh.
Mhm.
That's so funny.
That's a thing. You can go and research it. You'll find people with techniques for saying different syllables and all that stuff, which is fun to an extent. I think it's an interesting art, but then if you're trying to be natural on the mic, you don't want to be worrying about all that
Right,
too much.
right, right. Well, I might look some of it up. I have a really hard time saying my own name, Pam Uzel, because it's a very unnatural flow. And I have a lot of people who like call me Miss Muzel, Miss, the M and then the U. It just is, that's been something that when I introduce myself, it's like, oh my God, I can't say my own name.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it takes practice. However you want to say it is how it should be said. How about that?
Well, I'll take your word for it. So, Catherine, where can people find out more about you and your work and your podcast?
Sure. So the podcast is called Material Feels, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts: Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, but also just any app that you already listen to shows on. You can find Material Feels. I also have a little production company. It's called CXM Productions, and I specialize in art and hands on audio experiences and workshops. And you can find information about me and the company at cxmproductions.com. You also will find that I have an Etsy shop where I sell my ceramic work because clay is still my main boo other than audio. So if you enjoy the show, you can DM me on Instagram at Material Feels, or you can email me. I love hearing from people, and I'm always down to talk audio with our community.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for talking with me today, because I've learned a lot just from listening to your podcast. And I'm really happy that you came on the show and shared a little bit about your process and about your medium of your voice.
Thank you, Pam. I'm so honored to be on your show. I love it. Thank you.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you so much to Catherine Monahon for joining me on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds to talk about their podcast, Material Feels. If you want to learn more about their podcast, you can go to materialfeelspodcast.com. That's materialfeelspodcast.com. You can also check out their production company called CXM Productions. Many thanks to Inspector J, Leeson 3, DJ Griffin, and Quetzalcoatl for the piano music used in the opening of this episode. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District and Otto Waschenlage Instrumental by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian. This episode was edited by Eva Hristova. Thank you for listening to this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. If you like what you heard, please follow us on your favorite podcast app and leave us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Good Pods.